It is all too easy to see difference as something that divides. But there are certain places in the world that have the power to unify, where the land encourages cultures to come together instead of falling apart. The area in Ontario, Canada, that some people are calling the land between is one of those places. Here, two great ecological regions, the mythic and majestic Canadian Shield and the lush and fertile St. Lawrence lowlands, join together to form a vast mosaic of interconnected environments. In a very Canadian way, the land between's diversity has encouraged sharing between cultures for thousands of years. But the land between is not a utopia. It has little bits of almost everything and a lot of almost nothing. Famous Canadian poet Al Purdy refers to this area as the country of our defeat. And some Mississaugas refer to it as Shuniga, meaning leftover lands. This is the story of the Mississauga and Algonquin, who shared this landscape with their more southern Wendat and Haudenosaunee neighbors, of the first European visitors who were both inspired and repulsed by the land between, of the traders, the farmers, the lumbermen and miners who tried and often failed to succeed amongst the flat limestone alvars and undulating granitic barrens that characterize this region. And it is the story of generations of travelers and artists and dreamers who see beauty, inspiration, and even the Creator in the hidden places in between. You may already be familiar with some of the land between. It includes large parts of Ontario's famous Muskoka and Kawartha Lakes cottage country. But in many ways, the land between represents those special places everywhere that are still worth protecting. Places at the fringes of human progress and urban development. The hinterlands that have so far largely resisted change, but are now increasingly under threat. Places that represent the meeting of our greatest opportunities and our greatest challenges. This story is about our evolving relationship with these special places. Many of the unique qualities of the transition zone between the Canadian Shield and the St. Lawrence lowlands have been understood for centuries. Nowhere was that understanding greater than with the elders of the Rama First Nation, whose modern-day reserve straddles the southern edge of the Canadian Shield, but whose traditional territories spread much further into what is now northern Ontario.
When I was small, the harvesters, they would talk to me about two worlds. They'd say, you know where the Red Rock starts, just up at Flora Park to the north, all through the Muskokas, and we have property in Port Carling, our community does, and we would travel there in the summer. They'd say, you know, that's where the blueberry is, that's where the moose is, that's where the blackfly is, and that's where the pine tree is. On this side, where the limestone is, you find the strawberry, the white-tailed deer, the maple tree, and the mosquito. And they would talk in terms of they had to know both worlds. And that made us smarter than the average Ojibwe person, because most of them only grew up in their one territory, and they knew it well. But they had to know both worlds. They would talk in terms of the medicines were different, and yet if there was not enough on one side, a particular medicine that they required, there would be an equivalent medicine on the other side. So that's how I got introduced to it, and I've been telling that story for a long time. And it's only the last little while that I've got to appreciate that there's this little ribbon of land that has has a mixture of both, dancing over Mother Earth.
The first person to really draw attention to the dancing ribbon of land that would become known as the Land Between was probably Peter Alley. And so you might say that the story of the Land Between begins here at Muldrew Lake, just south of Gravenhurst, at the Alley family cottage.
Peter was on this lake when he was 1, and he had been here every summer in one way or another. He loved to fish, and he loved to paddle the canoe. We went on canoe trips for many years after we were married. I spent our honeymoon on a canoe trip, and I'd never been on one before.
My dad was a very inquisitive man. He liked learning new things. I think he saw an opportunity to make a contribution to society, and he started looking into how maybe we could create a bit of a conservation reserve in some of the crown lands around Muldrew Lake. And so he started to look at what the landforms were like. At the west end, Muldrew Lake blends into the Torrance Barrens. And then he started looking at how the landform works farther abroad.
He looked around his cottage and he said, well, this is not the Canadian Shield, and this is not the St. Lawrence Lowlands. Where am I? And what he was seeing were these rock barrens. And when he got, I believe it was the Ministry of Natural Resources, to extract the mapping of where these barrens were in Ontario, they were circling the Algonquin Dome. They were only found in this region. And so he knew he stumbled onto something significant.
Peter was just like a dog with a bone. And he started talking to people. He talked to more people than you can count.
To define a region, you need some kind of criteria, and that's how Peter Alley had found me, because my expertise is about boundary detection. So that's how he contacted me to try to help them to decide where was exactly the location. So in this case, we focus on birds, because we had access to the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas that has been surveyed the area in 2001-2004. So we have a very nice update response of the bird to the context of the current land cover.
So the results of the analyses were basically, we found quite a distinct region within the Land Between where there were particularly high rates of change in land cover composition and also high rates of change in bird distributions. When I saw the results for the bird distributions, I thought, wow, like this, they're really heavily concentrated. So what it really allowed us to do is loosely delineate the Land Between.
It had been identified as a species richness hotspot in the first Breeding Bird Atlas, which was done in 1981 to 85. But we didn't have the benefit of the abundance maps. And it's really surprising at the number of species that have this transitional pattern that, they're either abundant in the south or abundant in the north, but then their range changes with that transitional zone of the Land Between. And it was also surprising, I think, how many species came out as being highly associated with the Land Between area. So for example, the golden wing warbler has something like 80% of its Ontario population present within the Land Between boundary.
It's really an area that is between the shield and the plain, and yet has its own kind of properties. So this is really the definition of an ecotone, and in this case, the geology beds are different.
The Land Between is actually unique geologically in Ontario because you have this remarkable transition from the shield rocks to the north.
This is a metamorphic rock, by which we mean it's been subject to great heat and pressure. And if you look at the mineralogy in the rock, it tells us that it was forming at least 20 kilometers underground. And by underground, we mean deep beneath high mountains called the Grenville Mountains, and they would have been bigger than today's Himalayas. So in walking over this surface, we were actually looking at the roots of these deep mountains, and we've lost at least 20 kilometers of rock. By and large, the surface that we see on the southern margin of the shield is much the same as it was 800 million years ago.
And as you come to the south, off the shield, as you drop down in elevation, you get onto the leading edge of the limestones. And these are the remains of ancient sea floors about 450 million years ago. And if I pick up a piece of the limestone, I can see it's full of fossils. It's referred to as a bioclastic limestone, where the entire rock is made up of the remains of fossils. And just here in the land between, the limestone is completely devoid of soil. As we go further south, they become thickly covered. And it's possible that the ice was moving sediment to the south, slowly stripping whatever sediment was here. But also there's been a lot of meltwater running across these surfaces, and it's probably washed these completely clean of sediment. In some places you see the actual contact where limestone is resting right on the shield, and that's called an unconformity. And there's many hundreds of millions of years that are lost between the formation of the shield and the first sedimentary rocks that are deposited on top. So it's only in this very narrow strip where you actually see this junction between two worlds. If you look at the land between, you can almost say it's the water in between too, because there are hundreds of lakes. And in many ways they're glacial relics. They've been scoured by ice. Ice has eroded fractured bedrock along faults and fractures. But they've also been cleaned out by enormous volumes of meltwater. Because at the end of the last ice age, as ice was retreating back through this area, the drainage from the large glacial lakes wasn't through Niagara Falls as the modern day drainage is. It was actually right through this area, the land between. And it's sort of ironic that the modern-day Trent Severn Canal follows precisely the route that the meltwaters did in the past.
The land between's geology is distinct, and so its biology is then distinct. So there are unique species that are more associated with the landscape than any other place in Ontario. The skink, for instance, the five-line skink, Ontario's only lizard. There's a population near Lake Erie, but the population here is genetically distinct. So we have 100% of this species population in this landscape. If you map the population of this five-line skink, it depicts this landscape.
One of the birds that seems to specialize in the limestone plains along the land between is loggerhead shrike. They're a strange combination because they're a songbird, which means they have songbird feet. They don't have feet like a hawk, but they're a predator, so they have a hooked beak like a hawk. And they feed on grasshoppers and beetles and small frogs, small mice. But if they want to tear those apart to feed them to the young in the nest, they've got a problem because they can't hold them with their feet. So they've come up with this very clever solution, which is to impale the prey, usually on the thorns of a hawthorn tree, because they like to nest in hawthorn trees. In Ontario, we have 2 pockets left, and that's it. And alvars are basically areas where you have flat limestone, very little soil, and as a result, it's too tough of a habitat for trees to grow. So we get lots of very interesting and unique plants that grow here, mostly small plants, wildflowers and grasses, that can't survive in other areas where the trees have shaded them out. They've been here for 10,000 years. As the forest took over the rest of the landscape, in the alvar conditions, these grasses and wildflowers were able to maintain themselves.
Also, an ecotone displays itself in terms of diversity. We have species here that are from the north and from the south. You have species all coming and meeting in this place.
Peter Alley convinced the Couchiching Conservancy and the Kawartha Heritage Conservancy to join him and try to discover more about the land between. As it turns out, the land between has the highest concentration of shoreline in Ontario. More than half of Ontario's globally rare limestone alvars are here. There are several animal species that appear to specialize in the land between. And the number of plant and animal species that overlap here are too numerous to mention. So why was such a major ecological region largely ignored until now?
It's a gradation, it's an ecotone, it's a transition, and it occurs at a scale that's beyond any one institution. So it's no one's job to think at that scale. And so things like this sort of slip between the cracks. until you get someone like Peter Alley who points attention to it.
The land between has been overlooked not only because ecologists and so governments typically manage homogeneous or uniform units, but also because municipality or municipal boundaries and the roadways, the way we travel, has always been north to south.
The funny thing about the land between concept is it was as if it was kind of in me, but I didn't know it was there. When I started hearing and reading about the land between, it was as if that was a latent image that was in me, and it was the discussion and the reading and the learning about the qualities of the land between that developed this image that was in me. And it's a really strong concept. It's a new way of thinking about where I live, and as such, it's very exciting.
Peter described it as you're having a glass vase on your coffee table. That's vulnerable. The land between is vulnerable. If your 6-year-old grandson comes in, bouncing a ball, that vase is threatened. The land between is threatened. So it's both vulnerable and threatened. And the threat comes from the press of development that's coming from the Greater Toronto Area. The Greater Toronto Area is going to be 1 million plus more than it is now in a matter of years. And they are going to look for land to build on. Not so much as an extension of the city, but if people who want recreational homes or they want to live in the countryside.
In terms of development across the land between, the highest pressure is on the shorelines. And these shorelines are the most sensitive to disruption because there is very little soil and a lot of shoreline. There's no absorption capacity. And so if you were to drop any contaminant in that water, not only can it not be absorbed readily, but it travels far and fast. This landscape is really important to the surrounding areas in Ontario. It provides clean water and an abundance of water to southern Ontario. It provides shelter and refuge for species at risk. In fact, for most of Ontario's species.
Peter was really determined that this should be a grassroots thing. He was, I think, hoping that there would be enough of a groundswell of information that the communities would come together and they would say, we want to save this place.
In 2006, at the age of 77, Peter Alley passed away suddenly, just as the idea for the land between began to gain momentum. His vision to better understand and ultimately help protect the land between was carried on by those he had inspired to look closer at this unique landscape, and by an organization that eventually became known as the Land Between Circle.
The land between is the frontier, the next frontier in conservation. We have the possibility, unlike southern Ontario, to apply preventative actions instead of trying to cure with Band-Aids. I strongly believe, as many people are discovering, as First Nations always knew, you cannot extract the person, the human, from the landscape. And in telling a story that's only one-dimensional, involving ecology, you are limiting or removing the relationships with that landscape. And it really is a flat story. And the story is extremely powerful because story allows you to see the relationships, understand the relationships, empathize with the relationships, but see yourself in the story. And if we are going to do conservation, we need to see our place in the story.
The earliest evidence we have of humans using the land between comes from a time when the glaciers were still receding to the north, more than 12,000 years ago.
The Algonquin people have occupied the eastern end of the land between since time immemorial. This land, it offered this great wealth of biodiversity, but it also required that you develop particular relationships with it if you were going to survive here. And if you did, it was loaded with medicines. I mean, you know, it's a little like the corner medicine store over there versus the large one, and the large one was in the land in between. Our people have learned to develop a very close relationship with the life givers of this land, and our culture has evolved from those relationships with this land.
The pictographs at Mazenod are the greatest cluster of pictographs in North America. There are over 260 of them along the rock here for over a kilometer at the north end of Mazenod Lake. So the glaciers had polished the sections of granite that later on First Nations people came and identified as surfaces that would be really good to place pictographs.
Well, ochre would have been applied probably with a person's finger, and the stain from the iron-based ochre would be held in place by a fixative of some sort. Cerebrospinal fluid of the sturgeon was a favorite, and it would be held in place there probably for a few days' time, and then a chemical reaction would take place. And then in time, that ochre would just wash off, but the chemically changed silica remains.
And so these pictographs lasted on that surface for many hundreds of years. Some people think perhaps as long as 2,000 years, but certainly many hundreds of years.
It's the stories that our ancestors told us. They left us stories on the rocks and on the walls of caves and different places. And that's significant storytelling. And that's what our people were about, is telling stories, communicating through stories. And we're very fortunate that they've stood up the test of time and they're still there for us to see.
This lake now is called Mazenod, but we call it Mazenozawin, which means picture, and Saiganing means lake. This was a sacred site for our people. We were a nomadic people. As a Anishinaabeg, it's not just the Algonquin, other Anishinaabeg probably traveled through here. And because it's a sacred site, they probably held ceremonies too in honor of our ancestors. And our ancestors are not just our people ancestors, because we're all part of creation. It's the rocks, the lakes.
And individual rocks would be thought of as grandfathers. Indeed, there's one rock projecting from the surface of the cliff, which is turtle-like. And there are teachings within the Aboriginal culture about the turtle. All of North America was referred to, and still is referred to, as Turtle Island. It's a great joy to me to be here with Aboriginal people and see their emotional response. And each one of us, I believe, reacts to the Mazenod rock and the Mazenod pictographs in a different way. It's a place where we learn about ourselves, not just about the land. Mazenod is one of several places, I would say 4 places, that are great gathering places on the land between. And we know this from archaeological evidence. Each one of these places has a character of its own. So here at Mazenod, the easternmost one within the land between, we have a place of worship, a place where people feel the awe of the land. Then on further to the west, Kinamagewapkong. We now call it the Teaching Rocks or the Peterborough Petroglyphs. And so this would be the school. And then we move further yet to the west, Couchiching. And here we have Minjikaning, or Toronto, depending on which language we use. And this would be the restaurant. The 4th place is Beausoleil Island. So this is the first major stopping place after people leave the interior and get out onto the big water of Georgian Bay. This would be the harbor.
A petroglyph is a rock carving into the rock, as opposed to a pictograph, which is also rock art, but a painting onto the rock surface. So the petroglyphs here at Petroglyphs Neutral Park are likely the largest known concentration of petroglyphs found in Canada.
The petroglyphs were studied archaeologically by a man and wife out of Trent University in the 1960s, and they said that they were dated from about 500 years ago to about 1,000 years ago, but we know they've been around longer than that.
The rock here is very soft. It's a metamorphic rock, and when the softness of the rock was identified by those early people, they used it to carve, and they carved petroglyphs for the purpose of instruction to the young people of their community. And in modern times, we think in terms of mass education, but the type of education was very personalized when these were used for instruction. These are living rocks. There's a deep connection with the past here.
It's a very special place. It's in fact a place where creation occurred, or a form of creation occurred. There's a lot of symbolism there which is consistent with our culture and so on. There's a clan system depicted there. The animals from the underworld are all depicted there. That is the snakes, the skinks that live there, the turtle. The turtle is an animal that helped creation happen from the underworld through cracks on the earth. The other thing that is very significant is that our people could hear the language being spoken by Manitou in the crack. But we really don't give much credence to that activity by our people because it doesn't happen anymore. I think if you were to try and explain this physically, it's the water itself running underneath there. It's like an underground river would make these sounds in echo, and hence it sounded like a spirit talking. But of course, we know it was a spirit talking.
The only idea that I have about who made the carvings in the rocks was that there's a little lake there, and it's got the blue-colored water in it. And I think that may have been something that they used for rheumatic people. And they would bring them there in the summertime and leave them soak in the water, and the other guys would then have nothing else to do but carve on the rocks.
The land between's vast system of waterways supported a large fishing economy. Not far from Petroglyphs Park, archaeological evidence remains of ancient fishing technology. The fish weir, or fish fence, near Lovesick Lake was trapping large fish for easy harvesting some 6,500 years ago. While the weirs at Lovesick Lake are likely the oldest evidence of fishing technology in the land between, the weirs at one of the land between's great gathering places, Minjickening, are undoubtedly the largest.
What's significant about the site at Minjickening, it's the largest wooden fish fence known on all of Turtle Island. They've carbon dated to be approximately 5,000 years old. 200, 300 families showing up, working in tandem, repairing what's broken, fixing the odd post that had fallen out, that come loose and maybe pushed out by ice. And that's why they find something that's 700 years old beside something that's 3,000 years old, besides something that's 5,000 years old. And these fish camps would run 6 to 8 weeks in the spring. Everybody had a role to play, and it was so large. It stretched into the watershed of Lake Simcoe, well into Lake Couchiching, and they say that you cannot harvest 100%. Some of the pregnant females need to be let go Some of the frisky young males need to be let go so that there'll be something for next year. And it's amazing that the same fishing hole fed thousands of people for 5,000 years. The same fishing hole.
In some ways, the plentiful supply of fish and other resources of the Minjikaning fish weirs was an exception in the land between. Some of the Mississauga who now live in the center of the region look at this land differently.
Well, my ancestors were drawn to Curve Lake, not necessarily for good reasons. Yeah, we are in our traditional territory presently, but then our main area of existing was on the north shore of Lake Ontario because of the Atlantic salmon. I like the word in the Ojibwe language, which means shkunigan, means leftover land. There's been some written accounts where it said that the reason we got this piece of land is because it was no good for farming, so it's left over. On the other hand, the north shore of Lake Ontario didn't provide like the wild rice that was available inland.
This plant is basically a staple in the diet of certainly the Ojibwa and the Algonquin people throughout thousands of years, really. Some of these lakes were just so thick with rice you could barely paddle through it. The native people used it for not only food, but it also attracted a lot of different types of wildlife: deer, moose, muskrat, beaver, all different types of ducks. A lot of the Indian archaeological sites are located very close to rice beds, so either they moved to the rice or they brought the rice with them and managed it. I suspect they probably took care of it just like other tribes take care of their resources and their gardens the same way.
Another species that may have been key to the survival of the land between's early residents is a fish that starts its life in the Sargasso Sea. The land between encompassed part of the extreme habitat range of the American eel.
American eel is a most interesting species of fish. It only spawns in the Atlantic Ocean in one place down near Bermuda, and by the time the young eels are the size of a small shoelace, they start working their way into fresh water. They now are on the endangered species list. But as we look back through the archaeological record of, say, 1,500 or even 2,000 years, there were villages established along the lower and also the upper Trent Valley system. And the question is, how could that many people have supported themselves? It's only later, probably around 1300 or so, when the community started to establish a more agricultural base. And since we know that the total biomass of eel was equal to the biomass, the weight of all of the other species combined, we hypothesize that probably there was such an extensive source of food through the eels that small village sites were able to be established very early on.
We're very mobile. We're very good at canoeing and making canoes. Two families working on a canoe could build a canoe in a day.
When I think about a birch bark canoe, I think of the rind of a paper birch tree, which is a temperate tree, tied together with the roots of black spruce or jack pine or white spruce, but those are sort of, I think of those as more northerly kind of things. And then, of course, made waterproof with the pitch of coniferous trees, which is leavened by a little bit of fat, bear fat maybe. So all of those things sort of are part of the north-south biodiversity, if you like, of the land between. But there's more to it than that. When I think of canoe, I think of getting in it at home and paddling out here, which is really a one world to another world kind of thing. And as such, I think this vessel, it could be argued, is really a vessel of the land between.
If you didn't have a canoe, you
You couldn't do very much. Any place we wanted to go, like in the summertime, Springfield, it was all by canoe. In 1966, we thought we'd paddle up to Perry Island, which is like Perry Sound. It took 5 days. That's a long way. We'd be trading medicines. Right around here is where the rock changed, like from the red rock to the limestone. So we were right in the middle of the. We had pretty much everything what we wanted. Perry Sound. They wanted something that was growing here up on one of the lakes, and they didn't have any up there. So we traded them. We visited all the reserves going up, and just to visit the people. It's a Trent Severn, yeah, we traveled it all the way. And then into Georgian Bay, and a lot of rocks in Georgian Bay. Yeah, it was nice. It's hard to get the wood for a shore dinner. You're up there, but...
People traveling through the region would likely have stopped at the final of the 4 great gathering places in the land between, Beausoleil Island.
Yosam Beausoleil Island ejnikade bam gondem gatio mnisens kirok meusha nishnabe ketche pizza chika me nokskawat ode. We mena jigging net question. We go to cookie and ma some necessity. Tangos naija, we na hego biamga. We na gonna mustoyin yosa. Asia gwana drung. Mina geo Asia natem gak. Tango we na de gego wamdan ma pisa necessity. Nishkego gawin mun negoko sa nok mesodigi banani watoda chikbik. Gi wadap nang yosa nebe. Gi shegi dap nang. Gim na kwetio embish. Wewene et koyo ebina mik. Meos gibina ma gibina gameyo nebe. Nongo da shwin gawin. Kina zem singo jama go jimanan bam gondegit. Mio gibanach toat yosam bish. It was a gathering place for all our Anishinaabe people to get together.
My family are from Wisconsin. They didn't want to go on the Trail of Tears that Potawatomi people have suffered a lot through. We migrated up north, what we call our grandmother's country. The reason why it's called grandmother's country because it had plenty of everything.
There was a lot of trading going on there. And you could see the evidence of that when they do the digs. They show us all the little artifacts that they find, and they tell us little stories about them.
Beausoleil Island is important for a number of reasons. First off, it has 7,000 years of human occupation, continuous human occupation. Beausoleil Island is situated at a transitional geographic space in Canada. Just to the north of where we're sitting now is the exposed granite bedrock of the Canadian Shield, and just behind me is the hardwood forests of southern Ontario, meeting right here at Camp Kitchie, more or less. And we have the same transition happening culturally in the archaeological record as well, with cultural material representing communities from northern Ontario, southern Ontario, and eastern Ontario, all arriving here at Camp Kitchie at the same time for some reason. We've just made a discovery yesterday of what looks to be almost a complete Huron pot. And I'm not suggesting that the people themselves were coming here, but their ideas were coming here, their material was coming here, and we find it archaeologically here. It's just an amazing story.
The cultural mixing revealed by the archaeological evidence and elder stories is not limited to Beausoleil Island. Evidence from throughout the land between reveals a little-known story. For millennia, the region has been primarily occupied by hunter-gatherers. The Mississaugas and the Algonquins, both part of the larger Anishinaabe nation that occupied much of the Great Lakes and were well adapted to life on the rugged Canadian Shield. But an interesting relationship appears to have developed here between the hunter-gatherer Anishinaabe and the agricultural Huron-Wendat people, who began moving into the land between from the fertile region south of Lake Ontario sometime before 1400.
The ancestors of the Wendat largely came from the land between area, well to the east of where Wendake, Huronia currently is, and was found by the French people of the early 1600s. So the ancestors of the Wendat, they've worked their way in stages slowly up the Trent Valley. By 1400, we're in the Balsam Lake area, on the Talbot River, at the Benson site, a well-known early Wendat site. This particular archaeological site was a large village site dating to about the year 1550. The site really had a strong focus on defense. The palisade around was 5 stockade poles deep. Another feature of this site is that outside the stockade was another longhouse. And because of the trade goods that were found at this site, it could be that these were various visitors that came here, Anishinaabe friends who were just very close to the north here, and mingled with these folks. This is clear through the archaeological evidence.
In certain times in their history, like we shared the areas with the Wendat. Wendat, that's our word, meaning people who live in houses. Our people, in the wintertime, the family groupings would break up into smaller groups. Some of them would go and live near the Hurons who provided some food, because our people talk about that, and that was a symbiotic relationship.
Large groups of Algonquins, we are informed that as many as 800 people could come and sojourn during the whole winter in the Wendat villages. And during those winters and during those times of togetherness, they would exchange on many, many levels. One aspect is the importance for the Wendat to maintain a closeness with the supernatural world, which they realized that they had lost some proximity to by becoming agriculturalists, and which the Algonquians maintained because they were hunters and depended very closely on maintaining a strict adjustment to the forces of nature, and which manifest themselves in the spirit of animals. And of course, the Wendat came to be the language of trade and diplomacy used in the whole region. Many young people would come and learn the Wendat language. I am pretty passionate about making Canadians discover that they have not really begun to explore the rich heritage of the social and political ideas that come from First Nations philosophies, especially from this Aboriginal civilization. When we do begin to discover this, we will be able to attain the ideals that we have as a country, which are to create a multi-ethnic, multilingual, open, caring society. We have the example of peoples who, 500 years at least before the Europeans ever came here, had achieved such a society of nations.
By the time the first non-natives such as Samuel de Champlain began visiting the region in the early 1600s, the Wendat had left their villages in the land between and moved to Huronia. Huronia had better agricultural land and was further from the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Six Nations Confederacy.
The Haudenosaunee and us had a few misunderstandings. It was particularly difficult when the French and the English were making and having their own difficulty and having their own wars, and it carried and spilled over into Ontario.
As the furs became scarce south of Lake Ontario, the Haudenosaunee, who were allied with the Dutch and the English, came into conflict with the Wendat and Anishinaabe, who were allied with the French over control of the fur trade. Champlain traveled through the land between twice in 1615. He left from Huronia with an Algonquin chief, Iroquois, and a Wendat chief, Ochtasekwen, to attack the Haudenosaunee south of Lake Ontario in the fall of 1615. Although his exact route is unknown, Champlain's records are the first recorded impressions we have of the land between. On the way down to Lake Ontario in the fall, he remarked on the pleasing character of the land.
It is certain that all this country is very fine and of pleasing character. Along the shores, one would think the trees been planted for ornament in most places. Moreover, all these regions in times past were inhabited by les sauvages, who have since been compelled to abandon them out of fear of their enemies. The cleared portion of these regions is quite pleasant.
Champlain's comments on his return trip in December were not as pleasing as his earlier journey.
When we first went out hunting, I penetrated too far into the woods in pursuit of a certain bird. My desire to kill it made me chase it from tree to tree for a very long time until it flew away. I got lost in the woods, going now in one direction, now in another. Night was coming on. I spent it at the foot of a large tree. I pondered to myself upon what I ought to do, praying God to be pleased to help me in my misfortune in this wilderness, for during 3 days there had been nothing but rain mingled with snow. When I finally found my way back to the savages, they begged me not to wander away from them any more, or else to carry about me my compass, which I had forgotten. On the 4th day of December, we set out from this place, walking on the river, lakes and ponds, which were frozen, and sometimes through the woods. Thus we went for 19 days, undergoing much hardship and toil.
Champlain did eventually reach Huronia. His maps, created in 1615 and then much refined in 1632, are the first to show any part of the land between. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy attacked and decimated Huronia in 1649. The great Wendat-Anishinaabe symbiosis ended. The remaining Wendat, who were not adopted into the Haudenosaunee, sought refuge with their Anishinaabe allies further north. Those Anishinaabe living in the land between were also temporarily driven from the region.
There was a point when this part of Ontario was empty because of pandemics and because we were in conflict with the Haudenosaunee. We were just a paddling distance away. Our old people said this, that we went away to pray for the Haudenosaunee. Now, we're very peace-loving people. We're very, our culture is so designed is not to make war. But if we have to make war, we're probably the best in North America.
The best account of the Anishinaabes' dramatic return in the late 1600s to the land between was recited by Mississauga chief Robert Pudash in May of 1904.
It being a matter of life and death to the Mississaugas, they held a great council of war and decided to attack the Mohawks, and if possible, drive them away. A party of Mohawks was entrenched at an island in Lower Georgian Bay, afterwards known as the Island of Skulls. The Mississaugas then advanced up what is now the Severn River to Lake Simcoe, stopping at Majikaning, which means fish fence, in order to get a supply of food. The main body proceeded along the Portage, now called Portage Road, to Balsam Lake. The other party went south to Toronto. After various skirmishes, the Mohawks continued their retreat down the valley of the Otonabee. At Campbelltown, an attack was made by the Mississaugas, both by land and water, and the Mohawks were driven after a battle in which no less than 1,000 warriors were slain.
A complicated series of diplomatic moves ended the Beaver Wars in 1701. More than 100 years later, in 1840, the peace ties between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee were renewed. At least 2 different wampum belts were exhibited. The second belt seems to have been lost, but its meaning was interpreted by Chief Yellowhead of Rama.
The Great Council took place at Lake Superior. The Naduways pointed out the different council fires which were to be kept lighted. The 4th mark represents the council fire lighted up at the narrows of Lake Simcoe, at which place was put a white reindeer. At the narrows, our fathers placed a dish with ladles around it, and a ladle for the 6 nations, who said to the Ojibways that the dish or bowl should never be emptied. But the right of hunting on the north side of the lake was secured to the Ojibways, And the Six Nations were not to hunt here only when they come to smoke the pipe of peace with their Ojibwe brethren.
And so a spirit of sharing returned to the land between after 50 years of war. For a while, the ideals depicted in the wampum belts of the early 1700s seemed to hold true. While there were big social changes as the Anishinaabe adopted French technology, the degree of change to the land between landscape itself was small. But with the defeat of the French in 1759, British control of the region would bring profound changes to this land and its original peoples. Join us next time as we explore how Europeans in the 19th century pushed colonization roads into the land between in a hopeless attempt to create an agricultural paradise.